good morning. So announcement number one, probably the most announcement I'm going to give today. It is my wife and I's anniversary today. Just want to acknowledge this. Allie has stepped up and helped out so much with the church, and she usually works, like last night she worked 12 hours before she came here this morning. So y'all give her a round of applause. She does a lot. She cares a lot about this community. And I'm married up for sure. All right, so we're going to dive right into scripture. We got a lot of ground to cover. Start reading this. And today's subject is not a fun one. Scripture says this: It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Ilahi, Ilahi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion, who stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." We've got a minute to discuss what you all discuss. So who would like to share? Yes, Allie.
We were just saying that it's funny because they were kind of like, as they were walking by, they were like, "Aha, got you."
Mm-hmm.
Like, you say you're with me dying right now on the cross, so you're not really the Savior.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And to be fair, there were a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah at this time. And there were a lot of rabble-rousers, too, that thought that they had divine authority to do so. And some people were frustrated with that. So that might have been part of this crowd that were just like, there's another Messiah, quote-unquote, hanging on the cross. And they, like I said, Jesus wasn't the first to make this claim. There were several others that did, which is why the Pharisees were so hard on Jesus and which is why they grilled him. Not that the Pharisees were good guys in this story at all, but in their defense, They heard this claim quite a bit, and it got them in a lot of trouble. What else we got? Bernie, what you got?
I'm just thinking about the gospel according to Brian.
The gospel according to Brian. Okay, I like it. I'm interested to see where this is going.
Always look on the bright side of life.
Always look on the bright side of life.
Give a little whistle.
If you haven't seen the gospel according to Brian, the Life of Brian, yeah, it's definitely worth a watch. I haven't seen that movie in forever. Yeah, this is a hard topic to lighten up, y'all. It really is. So I'm going to try to do so as best as I can. But I think in a way, this time of year in the church calendar, we're meant to kind of sit and wrestle with what's going on here. And we're kind of meant to be a little depressed because this is a depressing story. Now, you have a lot of people in this story attempting to discredit Jesus, as Allie pointed out. And at first glance, it appears that this taunting of Jesus was all started by the Jewish citizens. However, that is not so. This started with the Roman soldiers. Remember last week, they beat Jesus, they mocked Jesus, they put him in a crown, and they mocked him for claiming to be a king. And the inscription above the charge, that was the charge against him above on the cross, read, "King of the Jews." Now, there were regional kings, and we talked about this last week, that were appointed by Rome. But if you were not appointed by Rome to be a governing official, this was a crime punishable by death, which is why Rome secured Jesus and put him on the cross in the first place. Now, there were several Jewish leaders appointed by Rome in this passage. Some people may not be aware of that, but the high priests were actually appointed by Rome. The prefect before Pontius Pilate was responsible for appointing Caiaphas, and the prefect responsible for that was Valerius Gratus, and he was just before Pontius Pilate. So this was a known practice. If you had high priests, you went to Rome, they got the approval of Rome first to make sure they weren't going to cause any problems. They gave you the thumbs up, and you were a high priest. So yeah, they're kind of employed by the religious system of that time, but they did not have the public's best interest in mind at all. They were puppets of the oppressor. Now, the priest in the Gospel of Mark may have been taunting Jesus to discourage anyone from following the movement any further. Remember, there were still lots of followers of Christ, and they wanted this thing dead. And we see this today. This is not something that we're not accustomed to. Like, how often do we see Jerry Falwell Jr. and Pat Robertson and Franklin Graham criticizing champions of justice like Omar and like Tlaib and like Ocasio-Cortez and like Bernie Sanders? How often do we see that? All too often, right? All the time. They're corrupted by empire, and they wield their influence to maintain the status quo and to maintain corruption. Likewise, this is why the priests in this passage of Mark are stirring the crowd up and mocking Jesus. Now, oftentimes in the season of Easter, and we've discussed this before, it can be a very anti-Semitic season in the church if you're not careful, and we stand against anti-Semitism. Let me be clear, because in reality, the story of Christ's crucifixion is not anti-Semitic at all. It's anti-corruption. The same way that Omar is anti-Zionist and not anti-Semitic. Critiquing systems of power is not the same thing as being prejudiced against a group of people for their beliefs, for their race, for their gender identity, and for their sexuality. Besides, for all intents and purposes, we worship a Jewish rabbi every week. So obviously, we're big fans of the early church, and they were Jewish. I mean, if you didn't know that we were big fans, we talk about Jesus like almost every week on a weekly basis. We're kind of jazzed about Jesus. Now, we notice here in Mark that some of those witnessing Jesus being crucified seem to have been hoping that Jesus was going to come down off of the cross. Did you see that? And that did not happen, of course. And in fact, it would appear that Jesus is distraught about this predicament in this verse as well. Now, I believe that Jesus knew that he was going to be executed for subversion against Rome. But some scholars think that he did not believe he was going to be crucified, but rather saved by God at the last minute and given authority to rule Jerusalem, because that's what they thought the Messiah was going to do. The Messiah was going to be given authority over the region. And it's the belief of some credible scholars that in this verse, not only is Jesus mourning the loss of what he thought would be divine intervention of God rescuing the oppressed from empire at the last possible second, but so is the author of Mark lamenting the loss of this Messiah. Mark is mourning the death of the one that the author of Mark, believed that would set the people of Israel free. Now, one of Jesus' closest disciples, denied knowing him just before this. So no matter which way this went, whether Jesus believed he was going to be saved at the last possible second by God, or whether Jesus actually was knowingly going to be executed, knowingly going to die, this would have been painful. Because just moments before, one of Jesus' closest disciples denied knowing who he was. And some of the followers of Jesus are noticeably losing faith about the identity of Jesus as the Messiah in the crowds before Jesus. And Jesus, believing full well that he was the Messiah, now felt abandoned on that cross. And that's why Jesus cried out, Ilahi, Ilahi, why have you forsaken me? Why are you leaving me here to die before all of these people? Well, that is harsh, and that is dark. And I think it's important that we feel the depth of the pain that Jesus was going through on this day. Now, I have a little bit of a problem with this season in the church, because I was always taught that the cross was to be celebrated. But the cross was a tool of oppression And it literally slayed this beautiful rabbi that we love and adore and we remember in our Christian traditions. Now, in the end of this passage, something amazing happens. The temple veil is torn, and this is one of the most amazing parts of this text. The veil in the temple was the wall that divided the room from which the priests were allowed to enter, but the populace at large was kept out. It was a system of class within the faith of that time, and I love that it's destroyed in this passage, because I believe that the God of the Bible adores all equally, and our church should reflect that kind of divine equality. And the disciples of Christ in our denomination, we call this the priesthood of all believers. It's one of the pillars of our denomination. And I think that if the God of the Bible is a God of justice, and if the God of the Bible is a God of equity, then God must be sick of our traditions and our hierarchical systems within the church, and God must be disgusted by the megachurch and the temple and the cathedral. One simply needs to look to the text to accept this axiom. Think about it. The Tower of Babel destroyed. The tables of the temple were flipped. In this verse, the temple veil was torn. We keep building more elaborate and expensive religious facilities and services, but God keeps tearing that shit down. And I love that about God in this passage. Who wants to share? Yes, Bernie. So far, you haven't stolen my notes.
My biggest takeaway from today is your equation of Franklin Graham, Jerry Falwell Jr., Pat Robinson. Who was the other one?
We have Pat Robinson, Jerry Falwell Jr., and Franklin Graham.
It seemed like you had one more. Maybe not.
I think it was just the three.
So the fact that their whole mission is to maintain American empire. And to use their badges of religious authority to do that. I thought your equation of them with the bad guys of this passage, the priests in Jerusalem, is bold. And I was saying that you won't find very many clergymen in America drawing that comparison. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, man. I mean, I hate to offend them because that crowd is my biggest fan base. No, but it's true. And I mean, how that came about, we can look back in the 80s, right, with the quote-unquote moral majority, which is one of the most immoral groups of people I've ever met in my life. But that was totally a political move to gain power in the Republican Party. And what we've seen is the church has been galvanized to keep those very same people in positions of power, and it's an awful thing that I think the church needs to stand against. And no matter what your thoughts are on Pete Buttigieg, whether you're going to support him in the primaries or not, I will say this: I'm giving him mad props for taking a stand against right-leaning Christians and giving a voice to the left. Because, this is nothing new. We've been here for a while. We're just tired of playing nice. And I think we should be. I think it's time to make some noise. Even if there is a consequence, like there was with Jesus, it's going to take many people standing up to these kind of corrupt leaders before we see drastic change in this country. All right. Yes, Allie.
You're saying that Jesus called out by person. It shows that even he repent doubts. And it shows that you're not just supposed to be like you always say, Jesus, my followers, not converts. And it's okay to question your faith. As long as you come back to your stuff. It's just showing that Jesus has issues with some of the stuff that happens.
Yeah. I mean, I personally believe that Jesus knew he was going to die. I mean, I don't know how any sensible person could think that they weren't going to die back then, because this has happened so much to people. And I think what Jesus did is Jesus used the death that he knew that was coming to galvanize the movement. And I think if you look back in the teachings of Mark, Jesus was using this death that he said was coming the whole time to inspire the followers to take up the mantle that Jesus started. But I still think there was this moment of agony on the cross, which is one of the most painful things anyone could ever go through. I think there was a study I read not too long ago, and I'm not quite sure about how educated this person is in anatomy, but there was a doctor that did some kind of study that said, this process of crucifixion was one of the most painful execution methods of all time, that Rome had it down, and it was meant to be that way. So I just wonder if Jesus was just in extreme pain and was just crying out like, why have you forsaken me? Like, either kill me now, let me die now, or save me. And I can imagine all of us would be crying out as well. Today, as I said earlier, is my 1-year anniversary to my lovely wife, Allie. And to top it off, it happens to be the premiere of both of our favorite shows tonight, which we couldn't we couldn't celebrate in a more like Van Hall way. Like, we're so into this show because Game of Thrones is coming on tonight. Winter is not coming, winter is here. I'm so excited about it. And if you haven't seen it, it's one of the most gripping and interesting political dramas of all time. As a matter of fact, we got Maria into it, and we went through the entire show, like seasons 1 through 7, just before this came out. And so watching Maria watch Game of Thrones was one of the most fun things I've ever done in my life, because just this face of shock and hopelessness was just like on her face. It was great. So again, if you haven't seen it, if you're not really into fantasy stuff, if you're into politics, I really think you'll like the show. Because one thing that it portrays in this world that's created from political corruption that honestly is very familiar with our own, there are moments where hope seems lost and you feel that hopelessness too, but then on the next episode, somehow hope is found again. It's one of my favorite aspects of the show. And there's a scene called The Red Wedding, and now, I know many people haven't seen the show, so I'm going to try not to spoil it for you. But there were a lot of fans that dropped out of the show because of that scene, because they put all of their eggs in one basket. I'm really trying. If you've seen The Red Wedding, you know what I'm talking about. And you learn after the first few seasons of the show not to put all your hope in one character, right? But somehow, even though these champions of good, they're just slaughtered in the worst way possible, time and time again, there's always this spark that the evil powers that be can be torn down and tyranny can end. And I think many of us on the front lines of social justice today, we have those moments where we feel abandoned and we feel like hope is lost, right? I mean, this country was achieving so much in the realm of progress, and it was stopped in January of 2017. And it feels like our society is just taking a giant leap backwards to the 80s, back to that moment when the moral majority took power. That's what it feels like to me. And it's easy to become depressed and feel like the movement has all but died. But that's not the case. And that's not the message that the church needs to be sending. And we cannot put all of our faith in a handful of political leaders, because if we do that, we're going to make the same mistake that fans of Game of Thrones do when they put all of their faith in one character. What I love about the story of the early church is that they did not let the death of their beloved leader stop progress. The early church took up the mantle of restoration. They took up the responsibility of repairing this world. And sadly, for many in the modern church, Jesus, this time of year, is still on that damn cross, and we never talk about what happened after. The church galvanized and began to change the culture that had been oppressing them for so long. But I think there's something about the human condition that creates a need for a Messiah, right? And I think Jesus addressed that before his death, which is why the church succeeded. But we still kind of have our own messiahs today, and we put all of our hope in them, and when we see them lose or them falter or them die, then the movement just kind of fizzles out. And I think we have to ascend beyond that temptation to just put all of our hope in someone else doing the good work for us. We've got to be a part of the movement as well. But sadly, so many people need a leader to unite behind, to serve. And what happens to the movement when the leader doesn't make it through the fire is it's extinguished. There is this realization among the followers of Christ that they have a part to play in the resurrection of this world, which is why the movement didn't die with Christ. Hope remained with them, and it remains with us today. And I think the church needs to wear that hope on a daily basis, like it's part of our entirety, right? We still have hope, even though it seems all hope is lost. The cause of justice did not die when the NFL shunned Kaepernick. The cause of justice did not die when Trump stole the election with foreign interference. The cause of justice did not die when Brett Kavanaugh was unethically placed in a position of power. The cause of justice did not die when Bernie Sanders lost the 2016 primaries. The cause of justice did not die when the Republicans blocked Ocasio-Cortez's great Green New Deal. And the cause of justice did not die when Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Malcolm X or when Jesus died. The cause of justice has been left in our hands. And this cause beckons us to take up a cross of execution if necessary, while inspiring those suffering around us to do the same. Because if not us, then who's it going to be? The movement cannot stop with any one of us, but it has to start with every one of us. Yet so often we live in a space of crucifixion. We're all too willing to back down when the pain of great loss comes our way, but that is not the only choice that lies before the church today. We do not have to live in the pain of our loss. We do not have to live in the pain of injustice persevering in this country. We can use that pain to fuel our efforts to change the world. We have lost so many messiahs on the path to progress, but that is simply a reminder that you were always meant to be a leader for justice too. It is time for the church to take our eyes off the pain of the cross and go forth and do likewise, and go forth and be Jesus to the world, because this broken realm is not going to mend itself. So take heart, my friends. The movement has never died. It's just waiting for you to be a part of it. And we have to say that with all of the breath in our lungs, and we have to remind each other that this is not just about the leadership of one person. This is about joining the movement, because we outnumber those in power millions to one. And they know that, which is why they keep us divided. But if we can realize that together we are truly powerful, this world can change. So don't sit back and let other people do the work of the Messiah for you. Be Jesus to the world. Amen? Amen. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you. See you next week.